The collision happened fast. Al Capone's men hit the car, stepped out, and did the unthinkable. They slapped Bumpy Johnson's son right in front of his friends on a Harlem street. What happened next would show why you never disrespect the most feared man in Harlem. Before we start, hit subscribe and tell us where you're watching from. The summer heat in Harlem was suffocating. The year was 1931, and Lenox Avenue buzzed with the usual energy of a Saturday afternoon. Cars honked, street vendors called out their wares, and well-dressed men and women strolled the sidewalks. Nobody expected what was about to unfold at the corner of Lenox and 135th Street. A black Cadillac rolled through the intersection just as a blue Packard turned the corner. Metal crashed against metal. The sound echoed down the block like a gunshot. And the Packard belonged to Bumpy Johnson's son. He'd been driving with 3 of his friends, young men who grew up in Harlem's upper circles. They knew who their families were. They understood the weight their names carried. When the Cadillac's door swung open, 2 men stepped out. They weren't locals. Their suits were too expensive, their shoes too polished, their faces too unfamiliar. These were outsiders. And in Harlem, outsiders meant trouble. The taller one walked straight to the driver's side of the Packard. He didn't ask if anyone was hurt. He didn't apologize for the collision. Instead, he yanked open the door and grabbed Bumpy's son by the collar. Before anyone could react, his hand came across the young man's face. The slap was loud enough to silence the entire block. People stopped walking. Conversations died mid-sentence. Windows opened as residents leaned out to see what had happened. Bumpy's son sat there, stunned. His friends froze in their seats. The 2 men from the Cadillac laughed. One of them pointed at the damaged bumper and said something about teaching respect to Harlem punks. Then they climbed back into their car and drove off like nothing had happened. The crowd that had gathered stood in shocked silence. Everyone knew who that young man was. Everyone knew his father. And everyone understood what this meant. This wasn't just a traffic accident. This was a declaration. Someone had just disrespected the most powerful man in Harlem, and they'd done it in public, in broad daylight, in front of witnesses. Word would spread fast. By nightfall, every corner of Harlem would know what happened, and by morning, Bumpy Johnson would know too. As the men who slapped his son had no idea what they'd just set in motion. They thought they were making a statement. What they'd actually done was sign their own fate. Ellsworth Raymond Johnson didn't earn the nickname Bumpy from being soft. The name came from a bump on the back of his head, a reminder of the streets that raised him. But the streets didn't just raise Bumpy. They shaped him into something more dangerous than any weapon. By 1931, Bumpy Johnson controlled Harlem's underworld with an iron fist wrapped in a velvet glove. He was a businessman, a strategist, and when necessary, an executioner. Bumpy had come to Harlem from South Carolina as a teenager, running from a life that offered nothing but cotton fields and poverty. New York promised opportunity, and Bumpy seized it with both hands. He started small, running numbers for local operators, learning the game from the ground up. But Bumpy was different from the other street hustlers. He studied people. He understood psychology. He knew that fear without respect was temporary, but respect, built on calculated violence, was forever. His partnership with Stephanie-St.Clair changed everything. Madam Queen, as she was known, ran the most profitable numbers racket in Harlem. She was brilliant, ruthless, and she recognized the same qualities in Bumpy. Together, they built an empire. While she handled the financial operations, Bumpy managed enforcement. He made sure collections happened on time, that rival operators stayed in their lanes, and that anyone who challenged their authority learned painful lessons. But Bumpy wasn't just muscle. People called him the Professor because he read voraciously, spoke multiple languages, and could discuss philosophy as easily as he could plan a hit. He dressed impeccably, donated to community organizations, and made sure Harlem's residents saw him as a protector, not a predator. He understood that real power came from the community's loyalty, not just from the barrel of a gun. His connections stretched beyond Harlem. LuckyLuciano respected him. Frank Costello did business with him. MeyerLansky considered him an equal. In a world dominated by Italian and Jewish mobsters, Bumpy Johnson had carved out territory that even the most powerful crime families acknowledged. He'd done it through intelligence, violence when necessary, and an unshakable code. Protect your own, respect those who respect you, and destroy anyone who threatens either. His family was sacred to him. His wife, his children, they represented everything he fought to build. They were the reason he woke up every morning and the reason he put men in the ground when they stepped out of line. Bumpy had enemies. DutchSchultz wanted his territory. Oni Madden tested his boundaries. Chicago operators thought they could muscle in. But none of them dared touch his family. That was the one line nobody crossed. Until now. Until two of Al Capone's enforcers decided that line didn't apply to them. Alphonse Capone built his empire on blood and whiskey. Scarface, as the newspapers called him, controlled Chicago with a brutality that made national headlines. His ChicagoOutfit ran bootlegging operations that stretched across the Midwest, bringing in millions of dollars every year. Capone lived like royalty, threw parties that lasted for days, and eliminated his enemies with theatrical violence that served as warning to anyone who considered opposition. By 1931, Capone was at the height of his power. He owned politicians, judges, and entire police departments. His organization moved alcohol, ran gambling operations, and controlled prostitution rings throughout Chicago and beyond. But Capone wasn't satisfied with Chicago. He wanted more. He wanted New York. He wanted Harlem, and he sent his best men to take it. Machine Gun Jack McGurn was Capone's top enforcer. The name wasn't metaphorical. McGurn actually carried a Thompson submachine gun and used it with disturbing frequency. He'd been involved in the St. Valentine's Day Massacre, the infamous execution of 7 rival gang members in a Chicago garage. McGurn didn't negotiate. He didn't compromise. He walked into situations with overwhelming firepower and left with what he came for. Capone trusted him to handle the most sensitive operations, which is why he sent McGurn to New York. Vincent Mad Dog Coll was different. Where McGurn was calculated, Coll was unpredictable. He'd earned his nickname by shooting up a crowded street in broad daylight, killing a child in the process. The newspapers called him a mad dog who needed to be put down. Other criminals called him effective. Coll didn't care about collateral damage. He didn't worry about witnesses. He created chaos, and in that chaos, Capone's operations flourished. Frank, the enforcer Nitti, rounded out Capone's inner circle. Nitti handled the business side of enforcement, collecting debts, managing protection rackets, and ensuring that Capone's partners stayed loyal. He was quieter than McGurn, more stable than Coll, but no less dangerous. Nitti understood that sometimes the threat of violence worked better than violence itself. But when threats failed, Nitti had no problem pulling the trigger. These men believed they were untouchable. They'd conquered Chicago, eliminated rivals, and survived gang wars that left bodies piled in the streets. They thought their reputation preceded them. They assumed that Harlem operators would fall in line just like everyone else. They were wrong. Harlem wasn't Chicago. The men who ran Harlem didn't bow to outsiders, no matter how many guns they carried or how many bodies they'd buried, and they were about to learn that the hard way. Harlem in the early 1930s was a powder keg wrapped in jazz music and illegal liquor. Prohibition had turned every neighborhood in America into a battleground, but Harlem was different. This wasn't just about bootlegging. This was about identity, power, and the right to control a community that the rest of New York had written off. The territory wars in Harlem made Chicago's violence look organized by comparison. DutchSchultz, the beer baron of the Bronx, wanted Harlem's numbers racket. He saw the millions flowing through Madame St. Clair's operation and decided it should be his. Schultz didn't ask. He didn't negotiate. He sent his men in with guns and demands, but Harlem pushed back. Bumpy Johnson pushed back. The war between Schultz and the Harlem operators turned into a bloody stalemate that lasted years, with bodies dropping on both sides. Oni the Killer Madden operated the Cotton Club, and Harlem's most famous nightclub. He was British-born, Hell's Kitchen raised, and connected to every major criminal organization in New York. Madden understood that Harlem's real value wasn't in violence, it was in entertainment. The Cotton Club brought in wealthy white patrons who wanted to experience Harlem's culture while staying safely separated from its black residents. Madden made millions from this arrangement, and he paid Harlem's operators to keep the peace around his establishment. Casper Holstein ran numbers before Madam Queen took over. He'd pioneered the system that made Harlem's gambling operations so profitable. Holstein was a businessman first, a criminal second. He believed in community investment, funding black businesses, and supporting civil rights organizations. But when rivals tried to force him out, and Holstein showed he could be as ruthless as any mobster, he survived kidnapping attempts, assassination plots, and constant pressure from competitors who wanted his network. The unwritten rules of Harlem's underworld were simple but absolute. First, you didn't bring heat to the neighborhood. Police attention was bad for everyone's business. Second, you protected black-owned businesses and residents. The community's support was what kept operations running. Third, and most important, you never disrespected another operator's family. Business was business, but family was sacred. Men could kill each other over territory, over money, over perceived slights. But children, wives, mothers, they were off limits. Public disrespect carried its own weight. In the underworld, reputation was currency. If someone disrespected you and you didn't respond, you might as well hang up a sign inviting every ambitious criminal to take their shot. But the response had to be proportional, calculated, and public. You couldn't let emotions drive your decisions. You had to send a message that everyone would understand. Cross this line, and there are consequences. When Capone's men slapped Bumpy's son in front of witnesses, they didn't just disrespect Bumpy. They challenged the entire structure of Harlem's criminal hierarchy. And that challenge demanded an answer. The phone rang in Bumpy's office just after sunset. He was reviewing ledgers with Junie Bird, his most trusted lieutenant. Bird had been with Bumpy since the beginning, a quiet man who preferred counting money to spilling blood but could handle both when necessary. Bumpy picked up the receiver, listened for 30 seconds, and his jaw tightened. Bird watched the transformation. The relaxed businessman disappeared, replaced by something colder, something dangerous. Bumpy hung up without saying a word. He stood, walked to the window, and stared out at Lenox Avenue below. The streets were alive with Saturday night energy. People laughed, music drifted from open windows, couples strolled arm in arm. None of them knew what had happened that afternoon. None of them understood that the delicate balance keeping Harlem's underworld in check had just been shattered. West Indian Archie arrived 20 minutes later. Archie was a legend in his own right, a numbers runner with a photographic memory who could recall thousands of bets without writing anything down. He'd witnessed the incident from across the street. He gave Bumpy every detail, the make of the car, the description of the men, the exact words they'd spoken, and most importantly, the way they'd laughed as they drove away. Archie's hands shook as he talked. He'd seen violence before, but this was different. This was an attack on something sacred. 2 more witnesses followed. Both gave the same story. The men weren't Harlem locals. Their accents placed them somewhere in the Midwest, probably Chicago. Their suits were custom-tailored, expensive. Their car was new, well-maintained. These weren't low-level thugs trying to make a name. These were professionals, which meant they were working for someone with serious resources. Someone who thought they could operate in Harlem without consequences. Bumpy sent Bird to check on his son, and the young man was home, physically unharmed but humiliated. The slap had left a mark, but the emotional damage cut deeper. He'd been raised knowing who his father was, understanding the respect that name commanded. To be struck in public, treated like a nobody, in his own neighborhood, it was more than an assault. It was a statement that his father's power meant nothing. Stephanie-St.Clair arrived just before midnight. Madam Queen didn't make social calls, especially not this late. She'd heard what happened through her own network, and she came to deliver advice. Bumpy respected maybe 3 people in the world. St. Clair was one of them. She sat across from him in the dim office, lit a cigarette, and spoke plainly. This wasn't random. Someone was testing him. Someone wanted to see if the legendary Bumpy Johnson would swallow this insult, or if he'd respond. How he handled the next 72 hours would determine whether Harlem remained his or became a free-for-all. Bumpy listened, but he'd already reached the same conclusion. This couldn't be ignored. If he let this slide, every small-time operator would think they could challenge him. DutchSchultz would push harder. The Italians would reconsider their agreements. The entire structure he'd built would crumble. But he also couldn't rush in blind. Whoever sent these men expected a hot-headed response, probably had a trap waiting. Bumpy needed information. He needed to know exactly who he was dealing with and what resources they had. And only then could he deliver the kind of response that would settle this permanently. FrankLucas showed up at Bumpy's office on Sunday morning. Lucas was young, ambitious, and learning the business under Bumpy's mentorship. He'd heard about the incident and came ready for war. But Bumpy waved him to a chair and told him to sit down and shut up. Anger was a tool, not a strategy. They weren't going to run out guns blazing like idiots. They were going to think this through. Bumpy had already made calls. His network stretched beyond Harlem, into Brooklyn, down to Miami, and even into Chicago itself. By Sunday afternoon, he had names. The men who hit his son's car were Machine Gun Jack McGurn and Mad Dog Coll, both top enforcers for Al Capone. They'd arrived in New York 3 days earlier, staying at a hotel in Midtown. And making rounds to Harlem's speakeasies and gambling joints, they were scouting. Capone wanted to expand east, and he'd sent his best men to prepare the ground. This complicated things. Capone wasn't some neighborhood tough trying to make a reputation. He was one of the most powerful criminals in America, with resources that dwarfed anything in Harlem. Going to war with Capone meant going to war with the entire Chicago outfit, which meant bodies, police attention, and potential intervention from the Commission, the loose confederation of crime families trying to prevent exactly this kind of conflict. Bumpy reached out to MeyerLansky through intermediaries. Lansky was the money behind multiple operations, the accountant who kept the peace between Jewish, Italian, and Irish mobsters. If anyone could send a message to Capone that would be heard and understood, it was Lansky. The conversation was brief. Lansky confirmed that Capone hadn't authorized an attack on Bumpy's family. McGurn and Coll had acted on their own, probably trying to impress their boss by establishing dominance quickly. That changed the equation. This wasn't an organizational decision. This was two cowboys going off script. Madame St.Clair advised a measured response. Kill McGurn and Coll, and Capone would have to retaliate or look weak. Embarrass them, send them back to Chicago bruised and humiliated, and Capone might appreciate the restraint. He might even discipline his own men for creating a problem he didn't authorize. The goal wasn't maximum violence. The goal was maximum message. Well, Bumpy needed every criminal in New York to understand that his family was untouchable, while giving Capone a face-saving exit that prevented all-out war. Bumpy assembled his team. Junie Bird would handle logistics. Nat Pettigrew and Finley Hoskins would provide muscle. FrankLucas would watch and learn. They spent Sunday night tracking McGurn and Coll's movements. The Chicago men had gotten comfortable drinking at Harlem's better establishments, flashing money, talking loud about how easy it would be to take over these operations. They thought they were protected by Capone's reputation. They were about to learn that reputation only traveled so far. By Monday morning, Bumpy had a plan. It was simple, public, and designed to send exactly the message he needed. McGurn and Coll would get a lesson in Harlem politics. Capone would get a message delivered through proper channels, and everyone else would remember why you didn't touch Bumpy Johnson's family. The wheels were in motion. The only question now was whether McGurn and Coll would survive what came next. Monday night, McGurn and Coll walked into Small's Paradise, one of Harlem's premier nightclubs. The band was playing, couples were dancing, and the whiskey was flowing despite Prohibition's best efforts. The Chicago enforcers took a table near the back, ordered top-shelf liquor, and settled in to enjoy themselves. They had no idea they'd been followed since leaving their hotel. They had no idea that every exit was covered. They had no idea that Bumpy Johnson was sitting at the bar, watching them in the mirror. Bumpy waited until they'd finished their second round. He nodded to Bird, who moved to the club's entrance. Pettigrew and Hoskins positioned themselves near the back exit. FrankLucas stayed close to Bumpy, his hand near the pistol tucked in his waistband. Then Bumpy stood, straightened his tie, and walked directly to McGurn and Coll's table. The music kept playing, but conversations nearby died. People recognized Bumpy. They understood what his presence meant. McGurn looked up as Bumpy's shadow fell across the table. Recognition flickered in his eyes. He'd been briefed on Harlem's key players, knew who Bumpy Johnson was. But instead of showing respect, McGurn smiled. Mad Dog Coll leaned back in his chair, one hand sliding toward his jacket. Bumpy raised his palm, stopping them. He wanted to talk first. Violence could come later if necessary. Bumpy's voice was quiet, calm, almost conversational. He asked McGurn if they'd enjoyed their time in Harlem. McGurn said they had. Bumpy asked if they'd encountered any problems. Coll laughed, said nothing they couldn't handle. Bumpy nodded slowly, then described the incident from Saturday afternoon in perfect detail. The car accident, the slap, the laughter. He asked if they remembered it. McGurn's smile faded. Coll's hand stopped moving toward his weapon. The entire club was watching now. The band kept playing, but nobody was dancing. This was the kind of moment that became legend, the kind of story people would tell for decades. Bumpy explained, in that same quiet voice, that the young man they'd slapped was his son. He explained that in Harlem, family was sacred. He explained that they'd broken a fundamental rule and that ignorance wasn't an excuse. Then he asked them a simple question. How did they plan to make this right? McGurn started to stand. Before he'd fully risen, Pettigrew and Hoskins were at the table, guns visible but not drawn. McGurn froze. Coll's hand was still near his jacket, but he didn't reach for his weapon. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and in enemy territory. Bumpy let the silence stretch, let them feel the weight of their situation. Then he made his offer. They could settle this like professionals, or they could settle this like animals. Their choice. Machine Gun, Jack McGurn, who'd killed dozens of men, who'd walked away from the St. Valentine's Day massacre without breaking a sweat, sat back down. He asked what Bumpy wanted. Bumpy's response was simple. An apology to his son, delivered in person, in public, and at the same corner where the incident occurred, and a message delivered to Al Capone. Harlem wasn't Chicago. Different rules applied here. Capone wanted to do business in New York. He went through proper channels. He showed respect. He'd get respect in return. McGurn looked at Coll. Both men understood their options were limited. They could try to shoot their way out, but they'd die before reaching the door. They could refuse, and Bumpy would make an example that would echo through every criminal organization in America. Or they could accept the terms, swallow their pride, and live to report back to Capone. McGurn nodded slowly. They'd deliver the apology. They'd carry the message. Bumpy stood, buttoned his jacket, and walked out of Small's Paradise without looking back. His crew followed. McGurn and Coll sat at their table, untouched drinks going warm, understanding that they'd just witnessed a master class in power. Bumpy hadn't fired a shot, hadn't raised his voice, hadn't even made a threat. He'd simply shown up, stated facts, and made his expectations clear. That was real power. That was why Bumpy Johnson controlled Harlem, while men like McGurn were just employees. Tuesday afternoon, a crowd gathered at the corner of Lenox and 135th Street. Word had spread through Harlem's networks that something was about to happen. Nobody knew exactly what, but when Bumpy Johnson called a public meeting, you showed up and paid attention. At exactly 3 o'clock, Bumpy arrived with his son. 5 minutes later, McGurn and Coll pulled up in their Cadillac. The apology was brief and humiliating. McGurn spoke the words Bumpy had dictated, acknowledging the disrespect, taking full responsibility, and promising it would never happen again. Bumpy's son accepted with a simple nod. No handshake, no forgiveness. Just acknowledgement that the debt had been paid. The crowd watched in silence. By evening, every speakeasy, numbers joint, and street corner in Harlem knew what had happened. The message was clear. Bumpy Johnson protected his own, and nobody, not Chicago enforcers, not famous killers, not Al Capone's top men, could change that. McGurn and Coll left New York the next morning. They drove straight back to Chicago, where they delivered Bumpy's message to Capone personally. Scarface listened, his face unreadable. He'd built his empire on violence and intimidation, but he was also a businessman who understood mathematics. Taking over Harlem would cost money, resources, and blood. And the returns weren't guaranteed, especially if Bumpy had support from the local crime families. And according to McGurn, Bumpy definitely had that support. Capone made calls to MeyerLansky and LuckyLuciano. Both men confirmed what McGurn had reported. Bumpy Johnson was connected, respected, and firmly in control of Harlem's underworld. More importantly, the commission wouldn't support an invasion. They were trying to reduce violence, not start new wars. If Capone wanted to expand to New York, there were other neighborhoods, other opportunities. Harlem was off the table. The decision came down from Capone within a week. No further operations in Harlem. McGurn and Coll had acted without authorization, created an unnecessary problem, and embarrassed the organization. They were both demoted, pulled from high-profile operations, and sent to handle collections from small-time gamblers. For men who'd been at the top of the ChicagoOutfit's hierarchy, it was a devastating fall. Bumpy's stock rose dramatically. LuckyLuciano reached out personally to congratulate him on handling the situation without starting a war. Frank Costello sent a case of premium scotch as a gesture of respect. Even DutchSchultz, who'd been warring with Bumpy for years, backed off temporarily. The message had been received across the entire criminal underworld. Bumpy Johnson wasn't just Harlem's top operator. He was a legitimate power player who could face down the biggest names in organized crime. The incident reshaped territorial understanding throughout New York. Harlem became recognized as Bumpy's domain, as untouchable as Chicago was Capone's. Other organizations could do business there, but only with permission, only with respect, and never by force. The unwritten rules that governed Harlem's underworld became codified in practice. Family was sacred. Public disrespect demanded public response. And nobody, regardless of their reputation or resources, could operate without acknowledging the existing power structure. For Bumpy personally, the victory was bittersweet. He'd defended his family and his reputation, but he'd also escalated his profile. Federal agents were already investigating him for numbers running. This kind of public demonstration of power would draw more attention, more scrutiny. But that was the price of maintaining control. You couldn't rule through fear and respect without occasionally demonstrating why people should fear and respect you. The slapping incident became one of the most repeated stories in organized crime history. Old-timers in Harlem still tell the story to newcomers, embellishing details but keeping the core truth intact. Bumpy Johnson made Al Capone's top enforcers apologize in public. The story taught lessons that transcended the specific incident, lessons that applied to criminal organizations, legitimate businesses, and personal relationships. The first lesson was about calculated response. Bumpy could have killed McGurn and Coll. He had the manpower, the element of surprise and justification that most criminals would accept. But killing them would have started a war with Chicago, brought federal attention, and potentially destabilized Harlem's entire criminal economy. Instead, he chose humiliation over elimination, sending a message that was just as powerful but far less costly. The Chicago outfit learned that Harlem wasn't worth the investment. Other operators learned that Bumpy was smart, not just violent. The second lesson was about respect versus territory. Capone's empire was built on taking and holding physical territory. He controlled neighborhoods, cities, entire regions through force. But Bumpy's power came from relationships and respect. He didn't need to occupy territory with armies of gunmen. He built loyalty through fair dealing, protection of community interests, and selective violence against those who violated agreements. When the confrontation came, Bumpy had support from the commission, from local operators, and from Harlem's residents. Capone had 2 cowboys who'd gone off script. The third lesson was about understanding your environment. McGurn and Coll were apex predators in Chicago, where Capone's word was law and violence solved most problems. But they walked into Harlem assuming the same rules applied. They didn't understand the political complexity, the community dynamics, or the network of relationships that governed operations. Their ignorance nearly cost them their lives and did cost them their careers. Bumpy, meanwhile, understood exactly how power worked in Harlem, which is why he controlled it. The incident shaped how criminal organizations interacted for the next 2 decades. The commission used it as a case study in why territorial respect mattered. MeyerLansky referenced it in negotiations, pointing out that cooperation was more profitable than conflict. LuckyLuciano used it to argue for the elimination of old-school gang war tactics in favor of business-oriented crime. The shift from Prohibition-era violence to more organized, corporate-style criminal enterprise owed something to incidents like this one. For DutchSchultz, the lesson came too late. He continued trying to muscle into Harlem, refusing to accept that Bumpy's control was permanent. That stubbornness eventually got him killed, not by Bumpy but by the commission, who saw Schultz as a liability. The Dutchman's fate reinforced what the slapping incident had demonstrated. The era of individual operators building empires through pure violence was ending. The future belonged to men like Bumpy, who understood that sustainable power required intelligence, so relationships, and knowing when to fight and when to negotiate. Bumpy mentored FrankLucas using lessons from this incident. He taught Lucas that reputation was everything, that how you responded to disrespect determined whether others would test you. Lucas absorbed those lessons and built his own empire using Bumpy's playbook. When Lucas eventually took over parts of Harlem's drug trade, he did it using the same principles: controlled violence, community respect, and strategic relationships with corrupt officials and criminal organizations. The legacy extended beyond organized crime. Civil rights leaders in Harlem saw Bumpy as a complicated figure, a criminal, yes, but also someone who protected the community from outside exploitation. When white mobsters tried to take over black-owned gambling operations, Bumpy stopped them. When police harassed residents, Bumpy's money funded legal defense. He was no hero, but he understood that his power depended on community support, which meant giving something back. Bumpy Johnson died in 1968, but the stories survived. The slapping incident, the confrontation at Small's Paradise, the public apology. These moments became legend. They were told and retold, each generation adding details, stripping away others, but preserving the core truth. Bumpy Johnson was a man who demanded respect and had the intelligence, courage, and resources to enforce that demand against anyone who challenged it. The slap that was meant to humiliate became the moment that proved why Bumpy Johnson was untouchable in Harlem. Respect isn't given. It's earned and defended. And on that day, Machine Gun Jack, Mad Dog Coll, and even Scarface Capone learned that lesson the hard way.